The moment lasted less than a second, but for Chris Hale it felt like time had stopped entirely. 1 second, he was sitting at a polished table inside one of the most expensive restaurants in Manhattan, surrounded by men in tailored suits discussing investment numbers that reached into the tens of millions. Crystal glasses clinked softly under dim golden lights, and the low hum of quiet conversations filled the room like background music. Chris had lived this life for years now. The private dinners, the contracts, the power that came with building a company from nothing into something that investors fought to be part of. To everyone watching, he was exactly what the American dream looked like when it worked perfectly. But then the waitress walked toward his table, and the world he had carefully constructed began to fracture in a way he never could have imagined. At first he barely looked up. Another server approaching with menus or wine recommendations was hardly worth interrupting the conversation about an upcoming merger. But something about the sound of the tray trembling caught his attention. When Chris lifted his eyes, the color drained from his face so quickly that one of the investors sitting beside him thought he might be having a medical emergency. The woman standing in front of him looked just as stunned. The tray tilted slightly in her hands before she managed to steady it, though the glasses on it rattled loudly enough to turn a few nearby heads. For a moment, neither of them said a word. They simply stared at each other like two people who had just seen a ghost. Because the woman standing there in a black waitress uniform, holding a notepad and pen, was someone Chris had once believed would share the rest of his life. Her name was Lily Carter, and years earlier she had been his wife. What made the moment even harder to understand was the fact that Lily had disappeared from Chris's life without warning nearly 3 years earlier. There had been no goodbye, no dramatic confrontation, and no long letter explaining her decision. One morning, she had simply packed a few bags and left their home while Chris was away on a business trip. When he returned, the house felt empty in a way that echoed through every room. At first he assumed she was visiting family, but days passed without a message. Then weeks. Eventually, he learned she had closed her personal bank account and changed her phone number. After that, there had been nothing. No social media updates. No trace of where she had gone or what she was doing. Chris spent months trying to understand why the woman who had stood beside him through the hardest years of his life had vanished without a single explanation. Now she was standing less than 3 feet away from him inside a restaurant filled with wealthy strangers who had no idea what they were witnessing. The silence between them stretched long enough that one of the investors finally cleared his throat and asked if everything was all right. Chris didn't answer. His eyes had drifted downward, following the outline of Lily's body beneath the black uniform she wore. At first his mind struggled to make sense of what he was seeing, as though his brain needed several seconds to process a detail that refused to fit into any version of reality he understood. Lily's stomach was round, the unmistakable shape of pregnancy visible even beneath the loose fabric of the apron tied around her waist. The realization struck Chris with the force of a sudden impact. Lily wasn't just working as a waitress. She was pregnant. Very pregnant. In that instant, 1,000 questions crashed through Chris's mind all at once. The first was simple and impossible to ignore. How had Lily gone from living in a beautiful home overlooking the Hudson River to working long shifts carrying plates for strangers? The second question was even harder to face. If Lily had disappeared nearly 3 years ago, why was she standing here now looking like someone who had spent months struggling just to get by? But the third question was the one that made Chris feel as though the air had left his lungs entirely. Judging by how far along she appeared to be, the child she was carrying might have been conceived around the final weeks before Lily left their home. The timeline formed quietly inside his mind like a puzzle piece sliding into place. And that meant the baby might belong to him, or it might belong to someone else entirely. Chris Hale had spent the better part of a decade building a technology company that turned him into one of the youngest self-made millionaires in his industry. Business magazines had written about his relentless work ethic and the way he seemed to thrive under pressure. Investors admired him because he had the rare ability to see opportunities where others saw risk. But the investors at the table shifted uncomfortably as the silence dragged on. One of them asked Chris if he knew the waitress. Another suggested they order a bottle of wine while they reviewed the proposal documents spread across the table. Chris barely heard them. His entire attention remained fixed on Lily and the life she seemed to be living now. For years he had imagined that if they ever crossed paths again, it would happen somewhere ordinary, perhaps on a street corner or in an airport. He never expected to see her like this, working late hours in a restaurant while carrying a child that might change everything he thought he understood about their past. And as the seconds passed, one thought continued to echo in his mind louder than the rest. Whatever happened next would not simply reopen old memories. It would force both of them to confront a truth that had been waiting in the shadows for years. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. And what happened after that moment in the restaurant would slowly uncover a story about ambition, sacrifice, and choices that neither Chris nor Lily ever believed they would have to face again. For the people sitting at Chris Hale's table that night, the moment passed quickly. The waitress had taken their drink orders, written them down carefully, and walked away toward the kitchen as though nothing unusual had happened. But for Chris, the encounter had reopened a chapter of his life that he had spent years trying to close. As he sat there staring at the polished surface of the table, memories began returning in fragments. Photographs from years earlier, documents signed in quiet offices, long nights inside a small apartment where two people once believed they were building a future together. The version of Lily Carter he remembered had been hopeful, determined, and certain that the sacrifices they were making would eventually lead somewhere better. Yet the woman he had just seen looked like someone carrying the weight of several difficult years on her shoulders. And the question that refused to leave his mind was painfully simple. How did the woman who once shared Chris Hale's dream end up struggling to survive? The story of Chris and Lily had begun long before the money, long before the headlines praising Chris as one of the fastest rising entrepreneurs in the technology sector. Back then, they were simply two young people trying to build something stable in a world that rarely rewarded patience. They met in their mid-20s at a small community event in Columbus, Ohio, where Chris had recently moved after leaving a corporate job he found suffocating. Lily was working at a local bookstore at the time, the kind of quiet place where people spent hours browsing through novels while soft music played in the background. Chris had walked in one afternoon looking for a book on business strategy, but he left with something far more important. Over the following months, their lives slowly intertwined, shaped by long conversations about ambition, family, and the uncertain path they both hoped would lead to something meaningful. In those early days, Chris was far from wealthy. His idea for a software company existed mostly as sketches on a laptop and notes written on scraps of paper scattered around their small apartment. Lily watched him struggle through countless setbacks as he tried to convince investors that his idea was worth supporting. Some weeks they barely had enough money to cover rent and groceries, but Lily never treated those years like a burden. She believed in Chris with a quiet confidence that often felt stronger than his own. Friends who visited their apartment later remembered how the two of them seemed to operate as a team, encouraging each other through the uncertainty that comes with chasing a dream most people would consider unrealistic. Yet success has a way of changing the rhythm of a life once it finally arrives. As Chris's company began gaining attention, the pace of his world accelerated almost overnight. Meetings filled every hour of his schedule. Investors demanded constant updates. Business trips pulled him away from home for days at a time. At first, Lily celebrated every milestone with him, proud of how far they had come from those difficult early years. But over time, the distance created by Chris's growing responsibilities began to shape their relationship in ways neither of them fully understood. The small apartment they once shared was replaced by a large home overlooking the river, and the quiet evenings they once spent talking about the future slowly disappeared beneath a schedule that rarely allowed them to sit in the same room for more than a few minutes. Then, without warning, Lily vanished from Chris's life. One day she was there, and the next she was gone. When Chris returned from a business trip and walked through the front door of their house, he noticed immediately that something felt wrong. The silence inside the home was heavier than usual, and several personal items Lily always kept nearby were missing. At first, he assumed she had gone to visit family, but when he tried calling her phone, he discovered the number had been disconnected. Days passed without any explanation. Eventually, he realized Lily had closed her bank account and withdrawn the small amount of savings she kept separate from their shared finances. That discovery only deepened the confusion. There were no notes left behind, no messages explaining why she had chosen to leave. For months, Chris searched for answers that never came. He contacted mutual friends, spoke with Lily's relatives, and even hired a private investigator to locate her. But every lead ended the same way. Lily Carter had simply disappeared. Without a clear explanation, people around Chris began offering their own theories. Some believed Lily felt overwhelmed by the sudden wealth that had entered their lives. Others assumed she had grown tired of competing with Chris's company for his attention. Eventually, the investigation stopped producing results, and the mystery surrounding Lily's departure faded into the background of Chris's increasingly busy life. The company expanded into new markets, and the media began telling the story of Chris Hale as if he had always been destined for success. But now, years later, the unanswered questions had returned in the most unexpected place imaginable. Sitting inside that restaurant, Chris could not ignore the image of Lily standing beside his table with a notepad in her hand and a child growing inside her. The thought moved through his mind slowly, like a realization he was reluctant to face. If Lily had disappeared nearly 3 years earlier, why was she suddenly working here now? And if she had been carrying a child during the months after she left, why had she never told him? The timeline created possibilities that were difficult to ignore. There was a chance that the child she carried had been conceived during the final weeks of their marriage. And if that was true, then Chris had spent years unaware that he might have a son or daughter somewhere in the world. Across the restaurant, Lily continued moving from table to table with the quiet focus of someone determined to complete her shift without drawing attention. To the other guests, she looked like any hard-working server doing her job on a busy evening. But Chris watched her carefully, searching for clues hidden in the details of her expression and posture. Each time she passed near his table, he noticed how tired she seemed, how the simple act of carrying trays required careful balance because of the pregnancy that had already advanced far enough to change the way she moved. The contrast between the life Chris now lived and the one Lily appeared to be surviving felt almost impossible to accept, because the story between Chris Hale and Lily Carter had never truly ended. It had simply paused in the middle of unanswered questions that neither of them had been ready to confront. And the truth behind those questions, the real reason Lily disappeared, and the identity of the child she was carrying, would take years to fully uncover. What Chris did not realize as he sat in that restaurant that night was that the past he believed was buried had been quietly shaping the present all along. And the answers he had spent years searching for were now closer than they had ever been, waiting in a conversation that neither of them could avoid much longer. Long before Chris Hale became the kind of man who could walk into a Manhattan restaurant and reserve the most expensive table without checking the price, his life looked very different. He grew up in a quiet middle-class neighborhood outside Columbus, Ohio, in a modest brick house where success was measured by stability rather than ambition. His father worked as a mechanic who believed in steady hours and practical choices, while his mother taught at a local elementary school where patience mattered more than recognition. From the outside, their life looked ordinary. But even as a teenager, Chris felt a constant pull towards something larger than the small routines that shaped the town he grew up in. Teachers remembered him as focused and competitive, the kind of student who rarely accepted average results. If a project required 10 hours of work, Chris would spend 20. If a class offered the chance to lead a team, he volunteered before anyone else could raise their hand. Even in his 20s, when most people were still trying to figure out who they wanted to become, Chris carried a quiet certainty that he was meant to build something significant. That belief became stronger after he graduated from college and took his first job with a mid-sized technology firm. The position paid well enough to cover his expenses, but Chris quickly discovered that working for someone else left him feeling restless. The ideas he had for improving the company's software were often dismissed by managers who preferred safe decisions over experimentation. After 2 years of frustration, Chris made a choice that surprised nearly everyone around him. He quit the job that provided security and decided to start his own company. The plan existed mostly in his head at first, shaped by long nights studying market trends and sketching out possibilities on a laptop that barely held a charge long enough to finish a full presentation. It was during that uncertain period that Chris met Lily Carter, the woman who would become the most important person in his life long before the world ever learned his name. Lily came from a background that valued stability and family above everything else. She grew up in a small town not far from Columbus where neighbors knew each other well enough to notice when someone's porch light stayed on too late or when a car hadn't moved from the driveway for several days. Her parents ran a small diner where long shifts were common and every dollar mattered. Those experiences shaped Lily into someone practical and dependable, the kind of person who understood how easily life could become difficult if you ignored responsibility. When she met Chris at a community event one evening, she recognized the ambition in him almost immediately. What she didn't see as clearly at the time was how consuming that ambition would eventually become. During the early months of their relationship, Chris spent most of his days working on the foundation of the company he hoped would change his life. Investors were difficult to convince, and every rejection meant starting again with another presentation or another proposal. Lily watched him face those setbacks without losing the determination that had carried him this far. At the same time, she worked 2 jobs to make sure they could afford the small apartment they shared near downtown Columbus. One job was at a bookstore during the day, where she organized shelves and helped customers find novels they might enjoy. The other was at a small cafe that stayed open late enough for students and night shift workers to grab coffee after midnight. The schedule left her exhausted most days, but she rarely complained. While Chris chased his vision, Lily kept their lives together. Friends who visited their apartment during those years often noticed how different their roles were within the relationship. Chris spoke constantly about new features he wanted to add to the software platform he was designing, or about the investors he hoped to impress with his next pitch. Lily listened carefully, offering encouragement when he doubted himself and practical advice when he felt overwhelmed. The apartment itself was simple, filled with secondhand furniture and the kind of small kitchen where cooking dinner meant balancing 2 pots on a stove that heated unevenly. Some nights their meals consisted of ramen noodles eaten straight from the pot, while Chris described how his company would eventually grow beyond anything they could imagine. They owned an old car that rattled loudly whenever it started, and they joked that one day they would replace it with something quiet enough that their neighbors would stop noticing when they came home late. Those years created a bond between them built on shared sacrifice and quiet hope. Lily believed in Chris even when his ideas sounded unrealistic to the people around them. When investors rejected his proposals, she reminded him that persistence often mattered more than immediate success. When he spent entire weekends rewriting code or preparing presentations, she stayed nearby reading books or organizing paperwork he might need later. Slowly, after countless attempts and more sleepless nights than either of them could count, Chris's company began attracting attention. A small group of investors agreed to fund the project, giving him the resources he needed to expand the team and refine the software that had once existed only as a concept on his laptop. As the company began to succeed, the changes in Chris's life happened quickly. The small apartment was replaced by a larger home in a quiet neighborhood overlooking the river. The old car that once struggled to start each morning was traded for something new and reliable. Meetings filled Chris's schedule from early morning until late at night as investors demanded updates and clients requested demonstrations of the platform he had spent years developing. At first, Lily celebrated every milestone with him, proud of the determination that had finally begun to pay off. But success carries its own demands, and the more Chris's company grew, the less time he seemed to have for anything else. Gradually, the rhythm of their relationship began to shift. The evenings they once spent talking about the future became rare, because Chris often returned home long after Lily had fallen asleep. Weekends that once belonged to them both were now filled with business trips or last-minute strategy meetings. When Lily suggested taking a short vacation together, Chris would promise they would plan something soon, though that promise often faded beneath the pressure of new opportunities appearing faster than he could manage them. Lily understood that building a company required sacrifice, but she also noticed how the person Chris was becoming seemed more distant from the man she had supported during those difficult early years. At first, the changes were subtle. Chris spoke less about the life they were building together and more about the goals he wanted to achieve within the industry. His phone rarely left his hand, and even during dinner he often responded to messages from investors or employees who needed immediate decisions. Lily continued supporting him the way she always had, but there were moments when she wondered if the success they once dreamed about together was quietly creating a distance neither of them fully understood yet. Chris believed he was building a future that would give them both security and freedom. Lily worried that the same ambition might eventually take away the relationship that had once made those dreams possible. By the time Chris Hale's company began appearing in business magazines and technology conferences, he had achieved nearly everything he once imagined during those long nights inside their small apartment. The world now recognized him as a rising entrepreneur whose ideas were reshaping an entire industry. Investors praised his determination, and journalists described his story as proof that relentless effort could still lead to extraordinary success. Yet the same journey that brought him everything he wanted was slowly pulling him further away from the one person who had believed in him before anyone else did. Success was about to give Chris Hale the life he always dreamed about, but it would also cost him the one person who stood beside him from the very beginning. As the years passed, the company Chris Hale built from late nights and quiet determination began transforming into something far larger than either he or Lily Carter had imagined during those early days in their small apartment. Investors who once ignored his emails were now competing for the chance to fund his next expansion. The platform his company created was adopted by businesses across the country, and with each new contract the value of the company climbed higher. By the time Chris reached his mid-30s, financial magazines were already describing him as one of the fastest rising entrepreneurs in the technology sector. The modest lifestyle he once shared with Lily slowly gave way to something far more extravagant. The small apartment where they had eaten inexpensive dinners together was replaced by a modern home overlooking the Hudson River, a property large enough that some rooms remained empty simply because they had not decided how to use them yet. Chris began wearing tailored suits to meetings in New York and San Francisco, and his calendar filled with business travel that sometimes kept him away for days at a time. From the outside, it looked like the kind of success story people admire. Chris had taken a risky idea and turned it into a thriving company that provided jobs for hundreds of employees. His determination was praised in interviews, and young entrepreneurs often asked him for advice about how to build something meaningful in an industry filled with competition. Yet inside the home he shared with Lily, the same ambition that fueled his professional success slowly created distance in their personal life. The long hours he spent developing new strategies and negotiating deals meant he was rarely home before midnight. Even when he was there, his attention often remained focused on the glowing screen of his phone as messages from investors and managers demanded immediate responses. Lily noticed the change long before Chris realized it was happening. During the early years of their relationship, they had faced challenges together, encouraging each other through uncertainty because they believed the sacrifices would eventually lead to a better life. Now that better life had arrived, but it seemed to require more of Chris's time than either of them expected. Dinners together became rare because meetings ran late or flights were delayed. Weekends that once belonged to quiet conversations and small plans for the future were now filled with conferences, networking events, and business calls that stretched late into the night. Lily understood that building a company required commitment, but she also began to feel like a spectator watching Chris's life move forward at a pace she could no longer keep up with. The first serious crack in their relationship appeared during a quiet evening that began like many others. Chris returned home later than usual after a meeting with investors who were pushing for another major expansion. Lily had waited for him in the kitchen, hoping they could talk about something that had been on her mind for weeks. When Chris finally walked through the door, he looked exhausted but energized in the way he often did after closing an important deal. Lily tried to begin the conversation gently, explaining that she had been thinking about the future they once talked about during those long nights in their apartment years earlier. She told him she wanted to start a family, that the stability they had worked so hard to achieve finally made it possible to consider raising a child together. Chris listened quietly at first, but his response revealed how differently he viewed the moment they were living in. The company was expanding faster than he expected, and investors were counting on him to maintain the momentum that had made the business so valuable. To Chris, this stage of his career represented a rare opportunity to push the company to a level most entrepreneurs never reach. Starting a family, he explained, might require slowing down the pace of growth, and he wasn't ready to make that choice yet. He promised Lily they would have plenty of time later, once the company reached a point where it could operate without demanding every hour of his attention. For Lily, That answer felt like a quiet confirmation of something she had been sensing for months. The man who once talked about building a life with her now spoke primarily about the future of the company he had created. She tried to explain how the distance between them had grown, how she often felt alone in a house that had once symbolized everything they worked toward together. Chris insisted that everything he was doing was meant to secure their future, but the words sounded less convincing each time he repeated them. To Chris, success meant freedom and the ability to provide for the people he cared about. To Lily, the same success was beginning to feel like the thing slowly taking away the man she loved. The tension between them grew quietly over the following weeks. Conversations that once felt easy now ended with long silences. Chris believed the pressure of running a rapidly growing company would ease eventually, but Lily saw each passing month as evidence that his priorities had shifted in ways he might never fully recognize. The breaking point arrived one night, when Chris returned home after another long day of meetings and found Lily waiting for him in the living room. She had spent hours thinking about what she needed to say, and the determination in her voice made it clear that this conversation could no longer be postponed. Lily told him she felt like she was losing him to the very success they once celebrated together. She spoke about the nights she spent alone in a house that felt far too large for one person, and about the promises they made years earlier when their lives were simpler. Chris responded with frustration he had been trying to suppress for months. He reminded her how hard he had worked to create the life they now enjoyed, how every late night and business trip was part of building something that would support them for decades to come. When Lily accused him of choosing money over family, Chris fired back with the argument he had repeated many times before. "Everything I'm building is for us." The words echoed through the room, but this time they failed to reassure the person who mattered most. Lily listened quietly, her expression revealing that she no longer believed the explanation that once made sense during the early years of their struggle. To her, the future Chris described felt distant and uncertain, while the loneliness she experienced every day was immediate and real. The argument ended without resolution, leaving both of them standing in opposite corners of the room with a silence between them that felt heavier than any words they had spoken. Days later, Chris left for another business trip, assuming they would eventually return to the conversation once emotions had cooled. When he came back, the house felt strangely empty. Lily's personal belongings were gone from the bedroom closet, and several small items she always kept on the kitchen counter had disappeared as well. At first, Chris believed she might have gone to stay with friends or family while they sorted through their problems. But when he tried calling her phone, the number no longer worked. He searched through the house for any sign of a note or message explaining her decision, but there was nothing. Lily Carter had vanished without saying goodbye. There was no explanation waiting on the kitchen table, no text message arriving hours later to soften the shock. She was simply gone, leaving behind a life they had built together and a husband who suddenly realized how little he understood about the pain she had been carrying. Chris assumed that Lily had chosen to move on, perhaps deciding she needed a life far removed from the relentless pace of his career. For months, he searched for answers that never appeared, eventually convincing himself that whatever reasons she had for leaving were part of a chapter he would never fully understand. But the truth behind Lily's disappearance was far more complicated than Chris realized. And years later, inside a crowded restaurant where their paths crossed again without warning, that hidden truth was finally beginning to surface. The months following Lily Carter's disappearance forced Chris Hale into a strange routine of progress and unanswered questions. At first, he treated the situation like a problem that could be solved with enough effort. He contacted friends they both knew, hoping someone might have heard from her. He spoke with Lily's parents, though they insisted they had no idea where she had gone. Eventually, he hired a private investigator, convinced that the resources he now possessed could uncover whatever explanation Lily had chosen not to leave behind. The investigation produced fragments of information, but nothing definitive. A closed bank account here, a brief apartment lease there. Each lead suggested that Lily had been moving from place to place, keeping her distance from the life she once shared with Chris. Over time, even those small clues stopped appearing. The trail faded until the investigator eventually admitted there was little more he could do. Life, however, rarely pauses long enough for a person to resolve every mystery. While Chris continued searching for answers, his company was entering the most important phase of its growth. Major corporations began adopting the platform he had built, and each new partnership pushed the company further into national attention. The value of the business climbed rapidly, drawing the interest of venture capital firms eager to invest larger sums than Chris had ever imagined handling. Board meetings replaced the quiet evenings he once spent at home, and international travel became a regular part of his schedule. In public interviews, he spoke about innovation and opportunity, presenting himself as the focused entrepreneur determined to transform an entire industry. The world saw a man who had achieved the kind of success most people only dream about. Yet in private moments, when the meetings ended and the hotel rooms fell silent, Chris sometimes found himself thinking about Lily Carter. He wondered where she had gone and whether she had managed to build a life that made her happier than the one she left behind. There were nights when he replayed their final argument in his mind, trying to identify the exact moment things began slipping beyond repair. Perhaps if he had listened more carefully that evening, the conversation might have ended differently. Perhaps he would have realized how serious her concerns had become. These thoughts never lasted long because the responsibilities of running a growing company demanded constant attention. But the questions remained, lingering quietly in the background of his life like unfinished sentences. Years passed in that uncertain way. Chris Hale became known as a millionaire entrepreneur whose company continued expanding into new markets. The business magazines that once ignored his emails now requested interviews about his leadership style. His schedule filled months in advance with conferences and investor meetings. The home overlooking the Hudson River became a symbol of the success he had once imagined during those early years with Lily. Yet despite everything he achieved, the mystery surrounding Lily's disappearance never completely faded. It existed like a shadow behind the accomplishments people celebrated, reminding him that one chapter of his life had ended without explanation. Then came the night that changed everything again. Chris arrived at the restaurant in Manhattan shortly after 8 o'clock, accompanied by several investors who were considering financing the company's next major expansion. The restaurant was known for its elegant atmosphere and discreet service, the kind of place where important conversations happened quietly over expensive wine. Soft lighting reflected off polished tables, while waiters moved carefully between guests who spoke in low voices. Chris had been there before, usually for meetings that required privacy and attention to detail. To him, it was simply another evening in a life that had become defined by business negotiations and strategic decisions. As the group settled into their seats, the conversation quickly shifted toward numbers and future projections. One investor described the potential value of expanding the company's platform into international markets, while another outlined the legal steps required to complete the acquisition they were discussing. Chris listened carefully, offering responses when necessary, but mostly allowing the conversation to flow while he considered the possibilities ahead. Nothing about the evening seemed unusual at first. The restaurant staff moved efficiently through the room, greeting guests and delivering menus with the calm professionalism expected in a place that served some of the city's wealthiest clients. Then the waitress approached their table, carrying a tray of glasses balanced carefully in one hand. Chris glanced up briefly, expecting nothing more than the routine exchange that begins every dinner service. But the moment his eyes met hers, something inside him froze. The recognition was immediate and overwhelming. The woman standing there was older than he remembered, the lines of fatigue around her eyes suggesting years of struggle he knew nothing about. Yet there was no doubt in his mind about who she was. The waitress holding that tray was Lily Carter. For a moment, the entire table seemed to fall silent. One of the investors paused mid-sentence, noticing the strange tension that had suddenly replaced the easy rhythm of their discussion. Chris stared at Lily as though the distance between them had collapsed into a single point in time. The last image he carried of her was from years earlier, standing in the living room of the house they once shared. Now she wore a simple black uniform with an apron tied around her waist, the clothing of someone who spent long hours serving strangers in order to earn a living. The contrast between the life Chris now lived and the one Lily appeared to be surviving was impossible to ignore. But what struck him even harder was the detail he noticed a moment later. Lily was pregnant. The curve of her stomach was unmistakable beneath the fabric of the uniform, forcing Chris to confront a possibility he had never considered before. Judging by how far along she appeared, the child she was carrying might have been conceived months earlier. The realization formed slowly in his mind as he tried to calculate the timeline of their last weeks together. Questions began racing through his thoughts faster than he could organize them. Lily maintained her composure long enough to place the glasses on the table and asked the group if they would like to start with drinks. Her voice sounded controlled, though the slight tremor in her hands suggested the moment was affecting her just as deeply. Chris barely heard the conversation happening around him. His attention remained fixed on the woman he had spent years wondering about, now standing only a few feet away after disappearing from his life without explanation. When she turned to leave, he stood abruptly, surprising the investors who had never seen him react so strongly to anything. He followed her across the dining room and gently touched her arm near the entrance to the kitchen. Lily stopped, but did not immediately turn around. When she finally faced him, the exhaustion in her expression became impossible to miss. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The noise of the restaurant faded into the background as they stood there confronting a past that had suddenly returned without warning. Chris finally broke the silence with a question that had already begun echoing inside his mind the moment he noticed her condition. He asked her why she had never told him about the pregnancy. The words felt awkward and incomplete because he still did not understand what he was seeing. Lily looked down briefly, as though deciding how much of the truth she was willing to reveal in a place filled with strangers. When she answered, her voice was soft but firm. She said he was never supposed to find out. The response left Chris even more confused than before. It suggested that Lily had made a deliberate effort to keep this part of her life hidden from him, though the reason remained unclear. For years he believed her disappearance was the result of anger or disappointment over the choices he had made during the final months of their marriage. But the presence of the child she carried hinted at something far more complicated than a simple decision to walk away. As Lily prepared to return to her duties inside the restaurant, Chris realized that the mystery surrounding her disappearance had not been solved by this unexpected reunion. Instead, it had grown deeper, because the quiet determination in her voice suggested that the truth behind those missing years involved more than the argument that ended their marriage. And whatever Lily Carter had been trying to protect or hide all this time, it was clear she had not yet revealed the full story. Chris Hale stood in the quiet hallway near the restaurant kitchen, still trying to understand what Lily Carter meant when she said he was never supposed to find out. The sentence lingered between them like a locked door that neither of them had opened yet. For years, Chris believed Lily's disappearance had been an act of frustration or exhaustion after the arguments that filled the final weeks of their marriage. Now, seeing her again and noticing the child she carried, he understood that the story must have been far more complicated than he ever imagined. The woman standing in front of him looked like someone who had spent years carrying a secret alone. When Chris asked her to explain, Lily hesitated for several seconds. As though revisiting the memory required strength she was not certain she still possessed. Eventually, she spoke quietly. Beginning with the night, everything between them changed. Lily told him that the evening of their final argument had not been an ordinary disagreement about work or family plans. Earlier that same day, she had discovered something that left her both shocked and hopeful at the same time. After weeks of feeling unusually tired and distracted, she visited a small clinic near their home and learned that she was pregnant. The news had filled her with excitement because it represented the future she had been asking Chris to consider for months. She imagined telling him that night, hoping the possibility of becoming parents might remind him of the life they once planned together before the company consumed nearly all of his attention. But when Chris arrived home late and the argument began, the conversation unfolded differently than she expected. Each word between them felt heavier than the last, and Lily struggled to find the right moment to share the news she carried. While the argument continued, Lily stepped away from the living room to collect herself. In the quiet of their bedroom, she opened Chris's laptop, intending to send him a message she had drafted earlier explaining what she had learned that day. Instead, she noticed an email conversation that had been left open on the screen. At first, the messages looked like ordinary business correspondence, but as she read further, the tone of the conversation revealed something deeply personal. The messages were between Chris and a woman whose name Lily recognized from a recent company event. The exchange contained references to private meetings, late-night dinners, and comments that left little room for misunderstanding. By the time Lily finished reading, The hope she carried earlier that day had been replaced by a painful certainty. The man she believed she would raise a family with had been building another relationship quietly alongside the life they shared. Lily never confronted Chris about the messages that night. Instead, she closed the laptop and sat quietly in the bedroom, trying to process the realization that everything she believed about their marriage had changed in a matter of minutes. The argument in the living room continued without her, Chris's voice rising in frustration as he defended the sacrifices he believed were necessary for the company's success. Lily listened from the other room, realizing that even if she revealed the pregnancy at that moment, the news would not repair the trust that had just been broken. When Chris finally left for the business trip scheduled the following morning, Lily remained in the house for several hours thinking about the future that now felt uncertain. By the afternoon, she made the decision that would shape the next several years of her life. She packed a few bags, withdrew the small savings she had kept in a separate account, and left the house without leaving a note. The months that followed were far more difficult than Lily had expected. She moved into a small apartment in another city where few people knew her name or the story behind her sudden arrival. The pregnancy that once filled her with excitement now carried the responsibility of building a stable life without the support she had once counted on. Lily worked wherever she could find employment, accepting long shifts and modest wages simply to cover rent and groceries. Some weeks, she managed 2 jobs at once, leaving the apartment early in the morning and returning late at night with barely enough energy to prepare for the next day. Doctor visits became careful exercises in budgeting because every appointment meant sacrificing money that could have paid another bill. When her child was born, Lily faced the reality of raising a baby alone while maintaining the same exhausting schedule that kept their lives afloat. Friends she met along the way occasionally suggested that she contact Chris Hale, reminding her that the father of her child had the resources to provide a far easier life for both of them. But Lily refused every suggestion. The discovery she made the night she left had convinced her that accepting Chris's help would only reopen wounds she was determined to close. She told herself that whatever mistakes had been made in the past, she would build a future for her child through her own effort rather than relying on a man who had chosen ambition and secrecy over honesty. Years passed in that difficult but determined way. Lily moved between small apartments, always searching for opportunities that might offer slightly better pay or more stable hours. Some jobs lasted only a few months before circumstances forced her to move again. Through it all, she focused on providing for her child and maintaining the independence she believed was necessary to protect the life she had chosen. Yet even the strongest determination cannot shield someone from financial hardship forever. Medical bills and rising rent slowly eroded the small savings she had managed to build. Eventually, Lily accepted a position as a waitress in a busy restaurant, a job that required long hours but offered the possibility of earning enough tips to keep them afloat. When the restaurant where she now worked began scheduling double shifts during its busiest seasons, Lily accepted them without hesitation. The extra hours meant more time on her feet and less sleep, but they also meant the difference between stability and falling further behind on bills. She never imagined that one of those shifts would place her face to face with Chris Hale again. For years, she had succeeded in keeping her new life separate from the world he inhabited. The restaurant, however, happened to be a place where wealthy investors and entrepreneurs often gathered for private meetings. The night Chris walked through the door with his colleagues, Lily was simply another server assigned to the evening rotation. Now, standing in that hallway as the truth unfolded piece by piece, Chris finally understood why Lily disappeared without explanation. The silence that followed her story felt heavier than anything he had experienced in years. Every detail she revealed forced him to reconsider the version of events he had carried in his mind for so long. Lily had not left because she stopped believing in their future. She left because the future she imagined collapsed the moment she discovered the betrayal she had never confronted directly. And during the years Chris spent building his fortune and expanding his company, Lily had been quietly raising their child alone, determined to prove that she did not need the money or influence he now possessed. Chris Hale stood motionless in the quiet corridor beside the restaurant kitchen, absorbing every word Lily Carter had just spoken. For years, he had carried a version of their story that placed distance and misunderstanding at the center of her disappearance. But the truth Lily revealed was far more painful than anything he had imagined during those lonely nights when he wondered where she had gone. The memory of that final evening in their home returned to him with uncomfortable clarity. The frustration in his voice, the certainty that the future he was building would eventually justify every sacrifice he demanded from the people around him. Now he understood that while he was defending his ambition, Lily had been standing in the same house holding news that would have changed both of their lives. The realization settled over him slowly, forcing him to confront the possibility that the moment he believed was just another argument had actually been the point where everything important slipped beyond repair. For several seconds, Chris said nothing. The sounds of the restaurant continued around them, plates clattering in the kitchen and voices drifting through the dining room. But inside that hallway, the world felt strangely quiet. Lily leaned lightly against the wall, the exhaustion of years spent carrying responsibility alone visible in her posture. The distance between them was no longer measured by the few feet of floor separating them, but by the years of decisions that followed the night she walked away. Chris had built a company that investors valued at tens of millions of dollars. Yet standing there, he felt less certain of himself than he had during the early days when his future depended on convincing strangers to believe in an idea. Eventually, one question rose above the rest, simple and unavoidable. Chris looked at Lily, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it during the years they were married, and asked whether the baby she was carrying belonged to him. The words hung in the air as Lily lowered her eyes for a moment, as though deciding how much of the truth she was willing to share in that brief conversation. When she finally looked up again, she gave a small nod that answered the question without hesitation. The child growing inside her was his. The confirmation struck Chris with a mixture of relief and regret that he struggled to describe. Somewhere in the world he already had a child, a son he had never held and whose life had unfolded without his presence. The thought created an unfamiliar feeling inside him, one that no financial achievement or public recognition had ever provided. For the first time in years, the success that once defined his identity seemed almost irrelevant compared to the life he had unknowingly missed. But before Chris could speak again, Lily added something that changed the moment entirely. Her voice remained calm, though the strength behind her words made it clear she had spent years preparing herself for this possibility. She told him that knowing the truth did not automatically give him a place in their son's life. The child had grown up without his father, learning to rely on the woman who had worked tirelessly to provide stability despite every obstacle she faced. Lily explained that becoming a parent required more than a biological connection. It required presence, commitment, and trust, qualities she believed Chris had chosen to sacrifice long before their marriage ended. The statement landed heavily because Chris could not easily argue against it. Everything Lily said reflected the choices he had made during the years when his company demanded every hour of his attention. He had convinced himself that success would eventually create the life he and Lily once dreamed about together. Instead, it had built a distance that allowed the most important part of his life to pass by without him even knowing it existed. Standing there in the hallway of a restaurant where he once came to celebrate business deals, Chris suddenly understood the full cost of the ambition he had defended for so long. Lily pushed herself away from the wall and adjusted the apron tied around her waist, preparing to return to the dining room where customers were still waiting for service. Before she walked away, she looked at Chris one last time. The expression in her eyes was not angry or bitter. It carried the quiet determination of someone who had spent years building a life through perseverance rather than resentment. Without another word, she stepped back into the busy restaurant, leaving Chris alone with the weight of everything he had just learned. He remained in that hallway for several minutes, staring at the floor while the truth settled into his thoughts. Chris Hale had spent nearly a decade chasing success with relentless focus, believing that each new achievement brought him closer to the future he once imagined. The company he built now employed hundreds of people and generated wealth that most entrepreneurs only dreamed about. Yet none of those accomplishments could return the years he had unknowingly missed with his own child. In that moment, he realized that the empire he had worked so hard to create could not repair the parts of life that had already passed. Chris eventually walked back into the dining room where the investors were waiting, though the conversation about expansion and financial projections suddenly felt distant compared to the revelation he had just experienced. Across the room, Lily continued serving tables, moving carefully through the crowded space while carrying the responsibility she had managed alone for so long. Their lives had taken drastically different paths, shaped by choices neither of them fully understood at the time they made them. Chris Hale had spent years believing that determination and intelligence could solve almost any problem. But as he watched Lily disappear into the kitchen once again, he recognized a difficult truth that no business strategy could change. Some things in life cannot be rebuilt once they are lost. The time he never spent with his son was one of them. And that leaves a question worth asking anyone who hears this story. If you were standing where Chris Hale stood that night, realizing that success had come at a cost you never expected, what would you do next? Stories like the one involving Chris Hale and Lily Carter rarely leave people with simple answers. When you step back and look at everything that happened between them, the situation becomes more complicated than it first appears. On one side, there is a man who spent years chasing a dream, believing that success would eventually create security and opportunity for the people he loved. Chris Hale built a company from almost nothing, turning late nights, risk, and relentless effort into an empire that investors valued in the tens of millions. But in doing so, he lost sight of the life he was supposed to be building alongside Lily Carter. On the other side, there is Lily, a woman who discovered she was carrying a child at the very moment she realized her marriage had been built on a truth she could no longer trust. Instead of confronting Chris and risking another painful argument, she chose a different path. She walked away quietly and raised their son on her own, determined to prove that independence and dignity mattered more to her than the financial comfort Chris could easily provide. The years that followed forced Lily to live a life far more difficult than the one she left behind. She moved from apartment to apartment, worked late shifts, and raised her child without the support of the man who helped create that life. Meanwhile, Chris Hale continued building his reputation as one of the most successful entrepreneurs in his field, never realizing that the family he once argued about was already growing somewhere far away from the spotlight of his achievements. When their paths crossed again inside that restaurant, the moment forced both of them to face a truth neither could avoid any longer. Success had given Chris everything he once dreamed about professionally, but it had also taken away years of fatherhood he never knew he had. Situations like this raised difficult questions about responsibility, forgiveness, and the choices people make when they feel betrayed or misunderstood. Some people will believe Lily Carter made the right decision by protecting herself and her child from a life she no longer trusted. Others might argue that Chris Hale deserves a chance to be part of his son's future now that he understands the consequences of the past. There are also those who might wonder whether the truth should have been revealed sooner, before so many years passed without answers. Each perspective reveals something different about how people view loyalty, ambition, and second chances. That's why stories like this continue to resonate long after the final moment. They remind us that the decisions people make during the most emotional periods of their lives often shape the years that follow in ways no one can fully predict. Chris Hale now stands at a crossroads where wealth and influence cannot provide an easy solution. Lily Carter has built a life based on resilience and independence, and the child they share has grown up in a world defined by the choices both parents made. What happens next will depend on whether trust can ever be rebuilt after so many years apart. Now we want to hear what you think about this story. Was Lily Carter right to walk away and raise her child alone after discovering what happened that night? Or do you believe Chris Hale should have another chance to become part of his son's life now that the truth has finally come out? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, because conversations like this reveal how differently people view loyalty, responsibility, and forgiveness. And if you enjoy real-life storytelling about success, relationships, and the life-changing decisions people make when they are pushed to their limits, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story.